America becoming a fascist state? Professor Baehr, the floor is yours.
Perhaps I could round off the thanks by thanking Professor Gordon and the students in the University Union History Department for providing the venue today, and the Koch Foundation for its generous financial support. There is something inherently obnoxious, wouldn't you say, about a foreigner interpreting a country to its natives. And this is especially true when the foreigner is no Tocqueville or Max Weber or Rebecca West, but just a person of average perspicacity. Though I travel widely in and across the US and take a studied interest in its history and political life, the credibility deficit is obvious. Recognizing it, I simply offer my observations today in the spirit of inquiry and engagement. We can read tonight's question in at least three ways. The first is to consider it as a rhetorical question, a question that answers itself. Posed like that, is America becoming a fascist state? The answer is yes, of course it is, and then we are supposed to show how. Well, a rhetorical question lacks seriousness because it really is just dressing up a presumption into a query. So this is one question I'm not going to pursue further. The second way to read today's question is as an open question. Answering it requires knowing something about the concept and about the history of fascism. For instance, it requires knowing that fascism was not predominantly a movement of misfits, nor, despite some of its myth-making, was it an attempt to recreate the past. Fascism thrived in dense networks of civil society. It was idealistic and activistic. The majority of fascists consisted of youth of all classes, the artistic avant-garde, for example, the Italian futurists and some of the modernists, the educated, the scientifically curious. Fascism was attractive to academics and professionals. It drew support from all classes. The third way to read tonight's question is not as a question at all, in which facts and concepts are at issue, but as a political declaration. And from this angle, the question is no more than a rallying cry. Is America becoming a fascist state equates to the slogan, we are the anti-fascists, you are the neo-fascist enemy, and we will destroy you. In this talk, I'm going to address the second and third ways of reading our question. I will further suggest that as well as being concerned about the American state, we should be concerned as well about the state of America. That is what is happening to social solidarity in this country, not least in American universities. So I begin by treating tonight's question as an open or empirical question. Because obviously, unless we know what fascism is or was, we cannot sensibly apply the concept to the US today. But knowing what fascism is proves tricky. Is fascism a time-bound phenomenon, largely exhausted by the defeats of 1945? Or is it a dormant, free-floating phenomenon that pops up periodically? How should we treat National Socialism in Germany? As a fascist state, or as a radical state in its own right? Was fascism a truly nationalist movement, or a pan-national movement? Hitler scorned nationalism. Is there such a thing as left fascism to parallel the fascism of the right? German Social Democrats of the 30s thought so. Was fascism in part a response to Bolshevism, fearing it and copying some of its methods? Or was fascism a movement with its own very peculiar trajectory? Hannah Arendt, Ernst Nolte, Stanley Payne, Roger Griffin, Francois Furet, A. James Greger, George Moss, Eugene Weber, all debate these alternatives. We cannot do that here. So instead, let me take a shortcut of defining fascism along the lines of the UCLA historical sociologist Michael Mann. A distinguished scholar, Michael Mann also stands firmly on the left of politics. No one will therefore be able to suggest that his definition has a right-wing bias. On Mann's account, historical fascism, Italian, German, Austrian, Hungarian, some of the cases he mentions, consists of 5 essential ingredients. The first, fascism, he says, was indeed an extreme form of nationalism. With a meager tolerance of cultural and political diversity, fascists gravitated towards an organic rather than a civic view of the nation. They saw themselves as the harbingers of a nation reborn, pure, martial, manly. Second, fascists were enthusiasts of the supreme state and the leadership principle. Both were to be instruments of the people's spiritual regeneration. Third, fascist nation-statism promised to transcend class conflict, knock heads together, and reintegrate divisive interest groups into corporatist, that is, state-led institutions. Fascism recruited from all classes, but had a sectoral bias. Public sector workers and professionals, such as lawyers, teachers, civil servants, doctors, and the police, that is to say, people away from the heartland of class conflict in urban heavy industry or manufacture, were disproportionately attracted to fascism. The corollary of these 3 previous ingredients is, fourth, a commitment to purge the social body of impurities. Those who opposed fascism were enemies to be ruthlessly cleansed. Foes might be political, or ethnic, or both. And the 5th prime ingredient of fascism was paramilitarism. Paramilitary organizations like the Italian squadristi, or the Austrian Heimwehr, or the German Stahlhelm, and SA and others, were staffed mostly by young veterans with a liking for combat. Paramilitaries provided men with a social home, comradeship, nourishment, alcohol, authority, the excitement of violence, in other words, a collective identity. Paramilitaries also provided socialization and the capacity to intimidate. They offered an assertion of autonomy from established elites and a weapon in the electoral struggle. Well, mention of these 5 ingredients may immediately ring alarm bells, or it may not. But nationalism, well, that sounds Trumpish. So does the leadership principle, if you like, and authoritarianism. And what about white supremacism? Is that not an invitation to cleanse by force? Yet it seems to me these similarities, and any others I can think of, are superficial. We are addressing today the question of the American state, and I see nothing plausibly resembling Michael Mann's definition of fascism in the current Trump administration. The fact that fascism was nationalist, if we go along with Michael Mann's view, does not mean that all nationalism is fascist. Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle are the obvious cases of fervent anti-fascist nationalists. Donald Trump's nationalism is not fascist either. Restoring American pride is not the same as creating an organic, ethnically cleansed white nation. The President's America First slogan does not distinguish between or among American citizens. It objects to non-citizens illegally parked in America. Trumpian nationalism is also the opposite of the aggressively expansive foreign policy of fascism, or of liberal nationalism and neoconservatism for that matter, both of which are flatly rejected by him and are also repudiated by the recently ejected Steve Bannon. Trump supporters lionize the military and flag, but are wary of and usually hostile to nation building and other foreign entanglements. And even if the Russian connection to Trump proves true, as Democrats pray, that could hardly be evidence of fascism. Vladimir Putin is a former KGB chief, pursuing policies of recognizable continuity with the Soviet Union. And even in the wildest anti-Trump speculations, I have not yet heard that Trump and Putin are reinventing the Hitler-Stalin pact. Nor have I yet heard Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer denounced as fascist quislings for working with President Trump on DACA and the debt ceiling, even if some Americans criticize them harshly for having any truck at all with the Trump administration. Fascists, we recall from Michael Mann's definition, worship the state. Donald Trump criticizes the state, calling out the deep state that is leaking heavily against him and declaring that he will drain the swamp of Washington-connected special interests. Nor does the president wish to enfold labor and capital into the state, as in fascist corporatism. Now I ask you, do the following remarks sound like Donald Trump to you? Under fascism, the state is the absolute before which individuals and groups are relative. The fascist state has its conscious conviction, a will of its own, and for this reason it is called an ethical state. Or how about this quote? The nation does not beget the state. On the contrary, the nation is created by the state. Or how about this? The state as a universal ethical will is the creator of right. These are quotes from the Doctrine of Fascism, 1932, a canonical pamphlet co-written by Giovanni Gentile and Mussolini. They don't sound Trumpish to me. Other contrasts between fascism and the Trump administration are just as salient. Dislike his policies as you may, the president has not subverted the Constitution. He has not suspended habeas corpus. President Trump's travel ban is in limbo, impeded by the lower courts, but still to be decided on by the Supreme Court. He was elected in the proper manner, even if he did not receive a majority of the popular vote. And as for authoritarian leadership and the leadership principle, where is it? The president is adored by his base, but is impeded in ways that the real Führer never would be or was. The president cannot even get his way with fellow Republicans to repeal and replace Obamacare. His tax reforms are delayed. His recent canvassing for Luther Strange in the Alabama Senate runoff failed to get Strange elected, and so forth. CNN, CNBC, The Washington Post, among other progressive outlets, gloat at how little Trump has accomplished in 9 months. Well, you can't have it both ways. Either Trump is a dangerous authoritarian about to transform the country for the worse. When? How? Or he is a weak president who is abysmally getting far less done than he or his supporters had hoped. Now, say you don't agree with my analysis. You then need to give me some specifics, and you probably will in the debate that follows. Specifics that connect the Trump administration to historical fascism. Now, I'll be candid with you and say that my own reflex is to be very wary of analogies, because I think they relieve us of understanding the distinctiveness of our own time by collapsing it into the past. But it's also true that playing loose and fast with analogies is a game that can seriously backfire on those who play it. Recalling Ecclesiastes' warning, "He that diggeth a pit shall fall into it, and whoso breaketh a hedge, a serpent shall bite him." Consider, for instance, the following analogies that can be drawn, if you wanted to draw them, between fascism and currents of the progressive left in America. First, just as the Nazis blamed Germany's defeat in the Great War on foreign bodies working in cahoots with domestic Jewry, the left today blames its defeat on the FBI and Russian meddling. The Democrats, or part of them, seek to mobilize on the basis of a myth of defeat. The Nazis did the same. Or how about another analogy, in the critique of cultural appropriation? Well, if you want to make comparisons, you might say that that resembles the fascist emphasis on cultural purity. How dare you speak about us if you are not a member of our culture? You are alien, contaminated. Stay away. Similarly, the conduct of Antifa could be compared to those paramilitaries I referred to earlier. Both, after all, are uniformed street gangs who violently attack opponents. Another analogy, and I'll stop with this one, is intolerance and intimidation, notably on American campuses. In a number of recent high-profile examples, Evergreen State, Middlebury, Berkeley, there have been others, conservative speakers have been threatened, manhandled, screamed at, screamed over, and their talks cancelled in fear of orchestrated disorder. Fascists would surely approve of the methods. But these tactics are certainly not liberal, at least if measured by early liberal standards of political dispute. John Stuart Mill, the father of British liberalism, actually sought out intellectual rivals to debate his views. Mill was confident. He looked for critics because he believed engagement with diverging standpoints would sharpen his own. He was equally emphatic that a summary of an opponent's argument is never as good as hearing it stated with conviction by the opponent. Only a believer, present and animated, is likely to give a nuanced, earnest, and sympathetic account of their beliefs. Says Mill, both teachers and learners go to sleep at their post as soon as there is no enemy in the field. Well, how far we have traveled since the days of John Stuart Mill. Rather than debate rivals, generally, we prefer to put them outside the circle of debate entirely. We prefer to attack their credibility, their probity, their rationality, and sometimes even their humanity. And this brings me to the second, which is really the third way of reading the question tonight, and I'll be briefer on this. And this is reading the question, not really as a question, but as a declaration and rallying cry. I start with the observation that describing America as fascist or proto-fascist is a claim that is almost a century old. Ever since European fascism came into existence, commentators have warned of American fascist tendencies. From the left and the liberal left, novelists from Sinclair Lewis to Philip Roth, and academics from Marcuse to Sheldon Wolin have depicted America in fascist or totalitarian terms. From the right, denunciation of American fascism begins with the New Deal. Later, the sociologist Robert Nisbet spied totalitarianism further back in Woodrow Wilson's War Socialism. So does Jonah Goldberg, an editor at National Review, whose 2007 book on this topic is called Liberal Fascism. Its subtitle is The Secret History of the American Left, from Mussolini to the Politics of Meaning. Now, just as I'm not convinced that the New Deal was fascist, and I'm not convinced that FDR's administration was totalitarian, nor am I persuaded that the Trump administration is yet one more fascist species. More than this, I question the attribution of fascist, this term more generally, because I see it as a poisonous way of handling social disagreement and political rivalry. In the 1930s, German communists unmasked their social democratic rivals as social fascists. German exiles to America, such as Adorno and Horkheimer, imported their own version of this idea when they described the so-called authoritarian personality, basically conservatives who did not conform to the Frankfurt School's Marxian Freudian vision of an emancipated society. Now we have Donald Trump, and the fascist accusation is used to tarnish him and other conservative populists. Rather like attributing phobic to ideas we do not like, fascist is a way of demonizing other points of view and putting fellow citizens outside the pale. This weakens the solidarity of American society. I have heard it said by some Americans that Donald Trump is not their president. In my view, as a foreigner, that is false and it is dangerous. Donald Trump is the president of the United States right now, whether people like it or not. And not liking it does not make him any less the president. Right now at UMass and on many other American campuses, one sees posters and logos denouncing hatred. How about adding "contempt has no home" at UMass? That might make a bit of a difference about how people talk to each other. Because if you really believe that we should not be hating, can I suggest you apply it to your fellow citizens, including Trump supporters who do not think like you? This is not happening. When famous comedians, pop stars, and chefs talk up their fantasies of assassinating the president, when stage productions of Julius Caesar cast Donald Trump as a dictator, murdered by virtuous Republicans, and the crowd cheers. When talk show personalities like Ellen DeGeneres say they would not host the president on their show. When actors ritually excoriate and demean the president during the Emmys and the Oscars and mock his supporters. When Democrats dispute the legitimacy of a constitutionally elected president. When all this happens, we have gone way past the cultural wars. We are approaching something far more serious that will not end well for anyone. If America is to remain one country and not fall into a state of civil war, its citizens will need to stop showing contempt for each other and start talking to one another. And what better place to do that than in a university? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that fine opening. We will proceed with the respondents in alphabetical order since their last names all begin with L. It took a little figuring out on my part, but Professor Laurie will be first.
First of all, let me thank you, Dan, for organizing this. He had to wake me out of a retirement bed to come here. But I was provoked by the question. I think it's an important question. I think it's also misconceived. I'm going to say at the outset that I'm not concerned about social breakdown in the U.S., nor am I impressed by disruptions of lectures and talks on campuses simply because they get magnified in the press. No one disrupted this one, and I dare say that the vast majority of talks on American campuses haven't been disrupted either. They're not likely to be more disruptive than anything else, so we can get to that later on. I'm taking a slightly different tack here. We will agree in part, I think. The provocative question of whether we're headed for a fascist America seems to be on many minds these days in the academy and without. This includes a recent essay by the German historian Christopher Browning, who turns a review of Volker Ulrich's Hitler Ascent, 1899 to 1939, into a comparison of the Führer and our president. Browning's sober and well-measured analysis is about as good as it gets, so I thought it might make a useful point of departure for our discussion today. We can safely pass over his contrast between the life experiences of Hitler and Trump because they're largely well known. Hitler's impoverished and directionless youth, undistinguished military career, likely virginity until his early 20s, as well as his dubious sex life thereafter. As against Trump's privileged origins, roguish early manhood, and ravenous sex life, whose singular achievement, in his own words, was somehow to avoid contracting an STD. Browning extends the contrast by observing the circumstances of Weimar that set the stage for Hitler's ascent, marked by humiliating defeats by the Allies, followed by the hyperinflation of the 1920s, in a newly formed republic whose virginal institutions of democracy proved too weak to withstand the whirlwind of Nazism. He's too shrewd of an observer, however, to overlook our own destabilizing similarities, ranging from the unspoken humiliation of defeat after defeat on the battlefield. We haven't effectively won a war since World War II, down to the seething anger over 40 years of flat incomes in the face of rising productivity, excuse me, as well as stepped up immigration from historically unfamiliar places. But he's more impressed with the differences than the similarities, correctly noting the Hitler and Nazism's early base of youths on and off campus before spreading through the population at large that sustained a party and, I would add, paramilitary auxiliaries which Nazi epigones built on their own from the ground up, a horrifying political behemoth that owed nothing to the economic elite or political regulars. This was new. It obviously appeared in Italy, but the point is the newness of these phenomena and their palpable strength. Plus the weakness of the opposition. I think this is key. We have the same thing in the U.S. today, I think, with the weakness of the political parties, which is, as I see it, explains an awful lot about the rise of Donald Trump. We can get into that later if you want, but as I see it, what's really happened here is parties have been displaced by millionaires. So every millionaire has his own candidate, and institutional discipline is really cracked and broken down. I think that's a dangerous trend. Indeed, it's the venality of the elite that Hitler parlayed into high office, along with the weaknesses of the rival parties, that allowed him to impose a totalitarian state with all that implies, without much opposition, within the short span of 2 years. Within 2 years, newspapers had been shut down. The political parties have been all but abolished. This is really a remarkable achievement in any nation's history, especially this one. I think Browning underestimates the rhetorical power of Nazism, but I think that's something we'll get to momentarily. Nonetheless, his arresting discussion of the factors that elevated Hitler strengthens his case for Trump's different ascent. The former real estate mogul entered the presidency from the outside without meaningful political experience. He has no coherent ideology, only a rich store of supposed grievances, slights, and injuries, as well as a large cache of personal economic interests. With Trump, the personal is profoundly political. He created no political party or political associations, relying instead on Twitter to rally the faithful, settle petty scores, demean the weak, and of course, tout his latest achievements. Even if he were a totalitarian ideologue, there's no reason to believe him capable of erecting a fascist state, because the institutions of liberal democracy, compromised compromised though they may be, strike me as too strong, as strong enough to resist, at least at this moment. We don't know what lies ahead. Even his allies in the business community who have stuck with him in order to realize their own agenda of tax breaks, deregulation, and so forth may well part ways if his unbroken string of political embarrassments and failures persists. As for his base of deplorables, who continue to believe that Barack Obama is the offspring of a Kenyan gorilla, that every Mexican is a rapist, every Muslim a terrorist, and every younger woman a sex partner, I think they will stick with him no matter what. Except this. The first obligation of any fascist state is to monopolize terrorism, to monopolize the instruments of military force, so that it must disarm the people. Totalitarian states disarm the people. We hear this again and again from the NRA in quite a different project. Unlikely though it is, wouldn't you love to see Trump take on the NRA? Do you really think that that's politically possible? That's no more possible than Trump taking on the religious establishment, which is also common to fascist states. So I think the discussion is somewhat misconceived. A fascist movement or state is far less likely than the continued threat of right-wing populism. And that's my point. That what I think we really need to talk about is right-wing populism, which in this country is more likely and more dangerous. It's a robust political expression based on xenophobia and racism that combines at once hyper-patriotism with a hatred of the state. It gestures toward anti-corporatism, but seems reluctant to support commensurate legislation. It can be isolationist or interventionist depending upon circumstances, but seems content right now to beat its chest. It has cropped up again and again in U.S. history since its baptism in the nativist parties of the 1850s, then again to the KKK in the 1920s, and once more with the paleoconservatives of the 1970s and forward. Such movements have effervesced in the past. They've either been enfolded into the parties, or they've collapsed at their own weight, or they've simply dissipated into thin air. Where does it lead? Where does this version of it lead? Who knows? We're still in an unknown point in a puzzling novella or a creepy saga, which brings to mind Joanne Lai's response to a reporter who asked how he felt about the impact of the French Revolution. It's too soon to say, he said. Professor Browning, no doubt, formulated his own position on the French Revolution very long ago. Not completely so, however, on the fate of Donald Trump. He ends his essay on a cautionary note, or more accurately, 4 of them, and here they are. Never underestimate a characteristic political outsider. You know who he has in mind. Or a program that puts the economically desperate to work. Invest no faith, he says, for his third point, in conservative traditionalist allies to put the brakes on upstart leaders. And fourthly, if it's the preservation of democracy you wish, one lesson from his study of the Weimar Republic and the ascent of Hitler is start it early, because you never know where it'll end up. To that, I would only add the singular importance of resisting panic over a terrorist incident on the home front or still another foreign intervention. Our more unsavory leaders have a long history of making mischief out of domestic crises and foreign wars. In addition, the newest edition of right-wing populism differs from its predecessor in 2 important respects. I suppose this is the point I want to land on. It enjoys the support of some of the wealthiest Americans, an unprecedented alliance of the rich and the poor, or the rich and the ordinary. Previous populistic expressions skewered the rich. This one drools over the rich. It's pulled back its horns of opposition to accumulated wealth. In addition, while all populist movements have sponsored their own organs, their readership was homegrown and largely Cosa Nostra, in-house. It's unlikely that people outside the early socialist movements and later populist movements read their press. That's over. The current complex of media formations enjoys an encompassing reach that has penetrated the mainstream. This new alliance of big money and the electronic media with ordinary people gives Trump-style populism greater staying power, more time to develop and evolve. I conclude. We do not know how it will evolve, but it seems pretty clear that if it does persist and Trump invents a military crisis at home, all bets are off. When the goons come to my door, I suppose they're more likely to be populist than fascist, but in the end, I can't be completely confident of the matter. Thank you.
We're pleased to welcome Professor Losier to the podium.
All right, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for coming here this afternoon, and also for those who organized this discussion. I think, like the speaker that preceded me, I take a little bit of issue with the question, and I want to take an opportunity to sort of toss it around and see what it might look like to look at it from a slightly different perspective. In her 2003 book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, renowned philosopher and political activist Angela Y. Davis offered a reflection that has a direct bearing on the question that prompts today's panel discussion. Quote, "When I first became involved in anti-prison activism during the 1960s, I was astounded to learn that there were close to 200,000 people in prison. If anyone told me that three decades later, 10 times as many people would be locked in cages, I would have been absolutely incredulous. I imagine that I would have responded something like this. As racist and undemocratic as this country may be, I do not believe that the U.S. government will be able to lock up so many people without producing powerful public resistance. This will never happen, not unless this country plunges into fascism." And I say that noting that I think today there's about 2.2 or 2.3 million people in prison. In offering some brief remarks here today, I choose to start with Davis's vignette because it is profoundly instructive in how it hints at a rich debate amongst black radicals over the nature of fascism and its manifestation within the United States. Quote, "Analyses of the U.S. as fascists have a long history in the black intellectual tradition," historian Robert Spencer contends. Black thinkers like Harry Haywood, Claudia Jones, George Jackson, and Kawasi Balagoon used fascism as an analytical framework to understand the rise of segregation in the South after Reconstruction, white populism at the turn of the 19th century, land and labor struggles in the Black Belt South, and the evolution of capitalism in the 1970s, end quote. Moreover, I would note that they took up the question that preoccupies us today, but principally in the past, as opposed to the present progressive tense. Within this intellectual tradition, the question has not been, is the U.S. becoming a fascist state, but rather, how has it already become one? And in answering this question, they have paid particular attention to the way in which the peculiar forms of race and class, or even national oppression here, mirrors those of regimes conventionally understood to be fascist. I must confess that while I, as a young graduate student, found Davis's insight compelling, my students on the university campus and beyond rarely shared this feeling. Indeed, for the first 6 years of my doctoral study, I taught at an adult high school in Chicago's West Side, a small experimental educational project serving formerly incarcerated men and women, where few of my students found Davis's points interesting. And this is to be noted that I often assigned Davis's short primer on prison abolition for our English class and routinely quizzed my students as to what society she said she would have imagined our country to have been plunged with such high rates of incarceration that they themselves had experienced. Even with multiple choice answers to the question being posed, my students invariably got this question wrong. During the heady days that bridged the second Bush and first Obama presidential terms, fascism, unlike matters of war, terrorism, and torture, was not a hot topic of discussion. But should they have been? For as legal scholar Michelle Alexander argues in The New Jim Crow, a book first published during my time teaching on the West Side, my students were essentially the cannon fodder of a new repressive arrangement that emerged during the 1970s and 1980s. Quote, a new regime of racially disparate mass incarceration has emerged in Chicago and become the primary mechanism for racial oppression and the denial of equal opportunity, end quote. For many of my students, nearly all of them African Americans and former state prisoners, this claim was not an academic exercise, but a reflection of their lived experiences. Many of the women in my class, for instance, have been convicted of a drug offense, indicative of the fact that roughly 90% of those sentenced to prison for a drug offense in Illinois are African American. According to Alexander, the half dozen men in my class were a small part of a population of black men in the city with a felony record, so large that it was equivalent to 55% of the adult black male population and an astonishing 80% of the adult black male workforce in the Chicago area. The impact of such a high concentration of incarceration within the city's most impoverished black neighborhoods and the resulting phenomenon of wholly legal discrimination is a phenomenon that sits at the core of Alexander's analysis and the stunted set of life chances faced on a daily basis by those I had the pleasure of teaching for some years. Yet in Alexander's discussion of racially disparate mass incarceration, she makes no mention of the prevalence of police surveillance and torture, the normalization of detention without trial, and the unaccountable use of deadly force by state actors. All easily acceptable features of a fascist regime. Preferring to define it and the legalized forms of discrimination it abides as the new Jim Crow. In this manner, she is in a sort of long-distance conversation with black liberals and socialists who promoted the World War II era Double V campaign, launched in 1942 and taken up by those in the black press and various civil rights organizations. The Double V campaign called for victory against fascists overseas as well as Jim Crow at home. For many of its proponents, this campaign married a firm commitment to the war effort with staunch opposition to discrimination within the armed forces and the military industries, commitments that had been taken up by the A. Philip Randolph-led March on Washington movement just a year prior. Although it regularly presented itself as loyal to the U.S. war effort, it also implied that there was an ideological and programmatic affinity between what was being fought against abroad and maintained domestically. As Langston Hughes's Beaumont to Detroit 1943 poem suggests, you tell me that Hitler is a very bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must have been in Beaumont that he had his start. Because everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right now, this very hour. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy, then why don't democracy include me? I ask this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. These sentiments would play a significant role in propelling the post-war black freedom struggle, particularly those efforts to contest Jim Crow segregation waged by war veterans. Yet amongst proponents of this campaign, Hughes was amongst those who went further in depicting the treatment experienced by African Americans as analogous to fascism. In contrast, Hughes's contemporaries associated with the Communist Party of the USA took up the question of fascism as not one of similar characteristics, but of as a threat attended to on the battlefield of class conflict. Yet in the manner that might be instructive for contemporary conversations, figures like Harry Haywood and Claudia Jones linked fascism not with the demagoguery of a Father Charles Coughlin and his Christian Front, but rather the maneuvers of ruling class elements constrained by the New Deal reforms and threatened by a growing workers' movement. For them, fascism was the dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of finance capital, a form of class rule without the pretense of liberal democracy. A generation later, a young Angela Davis would draw on this approach, warning of the threat of fascism amidst Nixon's law and order regime. Writing from the bowels of a Marin County jail, she anticipated that this danger was primarily restricted to, quote, the law enforcement, judicial, penal apparatus, what we today would simply call the criminal justice system. Quote, to arrest overt and latent revolutionary trends amongst nationally oppressed people, end quote. Depicting this threat as still in its incipient phase, a cancer that had not yet begun to metastasize, Davis suggested that it was one that might in the future target, quote, the working class en masse, and eventually even moderate Democrats. In contrast, her most important interlocutor, prison revolutionary George Jackson, took fascism in America to be an already existing problem, and in its most advanced form worldwide. Rejecting conventional definition of fascism as overdetermined by the historical examples of interwar Europe, Jackson diagnosed it as the maintenance of ruling class hegemony amongst massive state violence, white supremacist terror, and liberal economic and political reforms. As opposed to the general academic conception of a fascist one-party state, Jackson posited fascism as a prevalence of a more liberal rule, having reconstituted itself amidst a chaos of economic crisis and inchoate challenges from below. And this is Jackson. Corporative ideals have reached their logical conclusion in the US. The new corporate state has fought its way through crisis after crisis, establishing its ruling elites in every important institution, formed its partnership with labor through its elites, erected the most massive network of protective agencies, replete with spies, technical and animal, to be found in any police state in the world. The violence of the ruling class of this country, in the long process of its trend towards authoritarianism and its last and highest state, fascism, cannot be rivaled in its excess by any other nation on earth today or in history, end quote. For ethnic studies scholar Dylan Rodriguez, Jackson's argument, quote, posits a theoretical move beyond the Marxist telos of historical class struggle and suggests that the advance of capital and the hegemony of the ruling class are inseparable from the consolidation and expansion of the state's policing and punishing power. The condition of possibility for the emerging nominally liberal democratic, economic, judicial, and racial order. In addition to seeing the use of state violence by the fascist regime as being productive of maintaining its hegemony, Jackson also saw the judicious use of state violence as something that helped to produce in the US a form of what Adorno referred to as the authoritarian personality, the sort of degeneration of working class consciousness that made it easier for ruling elements to maintain their hegemony. Now, I want to present both Jackson and Davis's analysis of fascism in 1970, or proto-fascism, or incipient fascism in 1970 US, not necessarily to pick a side, because to some degree, they fundamentally disagreed over the question of, is the US a fascist state? But one of the things that they did agree upon is the importance of looking at questions of state violence. And in many ways, we see the legacy of their analysis in the conception of the prison industrial complex that proponents of prison abolition have put forward today, as one in which that identifies the sort of combination of corporate interests and state interests in the massive buildup of jails, prisons, immigrant detention centers, and understands that complex not only as a combination of those state and corporate forces, but also as a mentality that sees criminalization and incarceration as a fundamental solution to nearly every single social problem. And that approach to thinking about fascism not as a question simply of political personalities or the shouting down of college speakers, or even street battles between avowed fascists and anti-fascists, but it's fundamentally a question of state violence. It is something that I think that we have to learn and take up from some of the examples that have been offered to us by the Black intellectual tradition. Thank you.
Let me add my thank you to allowing me to participate and to my predecessors for really provoking a kind of interesting response. And I agree that I'm not going to entirely take on the question. I'm concerned about its framing, but I want to instead think about the way in which the issue of, as Professor Baehr puts it, moderation is drowned out by extremism. Yesterday, the Supreme Court heard the case on partisan gerrymandering in Wisconsin. I want to come back to that, but I want to think about a local example here in terms of moderating extremism. And it has to do with UMass students, since we're talking about sort of college speak-outs on campus. In 2004, the UMass Republican Club invited Judge Roy Moore to speak at the university. He had just been removed from the state Alabama court for erecting a monument. Here's one of those moments where we're thinking about monuments to the Ten Commandments in the Alabama Judiciary building. He came, and it was a packed audience. There were lots of sort of protesters at the event, but there were also, really interesting to me, handlers who were there. And they were there watching this case because I think it was more getting ready to make a national run for what was called the Constitution Party. The Constitution Party starts off as the Taxpayer Party in 1991. And in fact, I watched UMass students kill that possibility of this run at a national, it was a very small party, but run at a national presidential campaign possibility for Roy Moore. And it happened in this way. Moore got up and started to talk about his interpretation of the Constitution, and he wasn't making any moves. UMass students can sometimes be a little bit intimidating. They sometimes don't respond in the way that other students do. And Moore pulled out of his bag of tricks what he knew would get the audience, the Second Amendment. I had just come up from teaching at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and I knew the people he was sort of thinking of were like the students in Alabama, would sort of immediately respond to the Second Amendment, sometimes knowing it by heart. The UMass students did not. And in fact, they didn't because, in fact, Moore was speaking in the state that had, in fact, led the way on banning certain assault weapons, a ban that continues in the state today, 12 years after the federal assault weapon ban had expired. So that moment, and you could see kind of the recognition that, in fact, there were influences of moderation in around, depending on region, right? And the region in New England was very different from the region that really sort of seemed to be holding out promise for this particular individual. So last week, when Moore defeated Luther Strange, as Professor Baehr points out, in the Republican primary for Jefferson Sessions' Senate seat, despite Trump's support, brandishing a gun at a campaign rally to do so. And in fact, it sort of suggests that shifting moment, I think, that we are at. Moore had, again, been sort of reelected just to the Alabama State Supreme Court in 2013. He was removed for directing probate judges to enforce the state's same-sex ban on same-sex marriage. When he did this, Kellyanne Conway called this the success of Trumpism. And I think that's a really kind of key moment to thinking about this issue of moderation and issues of sort of region and influence. I bring up the UMass example because it speaks to this need for thinking about how moderating influences in our political system might work and what the issue before the Supreme Court right now suggests about how impossible that is. So the Supreme Court case, Gill v. Whitford, which recognized the way in which very high-speed software has been calculating the exact number of votes needed to win a district and re-gerrymandering districts, not unlike the Electoral College in the national election, as a tool for allowing the avoidance of moderation and actually the silencing of political democratic practices. I agree that we need to be careful in how we think about fascism, but perhaps we need to think especially about the historical specificities of understanding fascism. And while I appreciate the consultation of Mann, I would actually suggest that when we think about the way in which historians have thought and wrote and spoken about fascism, we come up with a kind of different framework, one that allows us to sort of think a little more about some of the contemporary redirectings. So I think especially, and this is the piece I was considering, historian Roger Griffin, a comparative historian of fascism, talks about the way in which one of the most important parts of this is not only the rebirth myth, the populist ultranationalism and the myth of decadence, but the tools for reassembling any possibility of resistance. And that actually brings me back to this particular case and to this moment. What are we thinking constitutes the state? What are we thinking constitutes the way in which the political participation is possible, and how do we see the silencing of that, not only in terms of these kind of explicit jury riggings of how we can participate, but also, as Bob Mueller is focusing, on the possibility of participation itself, right? So the use of electronic media, replacing the public square of discussion or the possibility of discussion by a series of rules and algorithms through Facebook's reimagining what conversation looks like. And the willingness, for example, of Facebook to take funding from anywhere, right? Sort of flagrantly using the language, as Mark Zuckerberg says, of radical transparency to actually replace politicians with engineers. What I see in the way that I see the rise of fascism in the 30s, in the 40s, is the replacement and the use of rationalization, statistics, whether it's the statistical software that allows us to re-jury rig districts in Wisconsin, or the algorithms that lead us to sort of not have the conversation or the possible conversations that we clearly had before, might have had before, to sort of leading us toward this direction. I want to conclude by picking up what, and I thank my colleague Kevin Young for bringing his attention to me, by another historian of fascism who really sort of gives us, I think, a broader way to think about this context. Jeff Ely talks about the severely weakening and diminishing turnout in elections, atrophy of proceduralism, and media-driven emphasis on packing and personality as the hollowing out of democracy, right? But he also sort of sees this term as applicable to the authoritarian coerciveness deployed against more isolated and isolatable populations, confrontations in the streets, as tolerated spearhead of a kind of a fascist state, the evading constraint and accountability, the intrusive policing and centralized gathering of information, the slow dismantlement of civil liberties, and the growth of a carceral apparatus, especially with respect to incomers, foreigners, and migrants. A profoundly disordering set of crises, one in which performativity of democracy at the very moment that it is wholly hollowed out leaves us with a model for what we need to think about. The possibility, and I think the difference in terms of Moore's attempt in 2004 and the current model in which we see, the triumph of Trumpism in its own terms, suggests that we really are headed to a moment where we really need to think about how we need to return to moderation, or what is it even possible. So thank you.
That we were learning through the spaces in between the different speakers, and I felt like we did get four clear and distinct formulations juxtaposed against each other in a very thought-provoking, creative way. Well, if we ask ourselves not who has won in this exchange, but what has the level of the exchange been, I hope you agree with me that it's been a very high level, well-formulated series of commentary. So I want to conclude by thanking Peter Baehr for coming from such a long way and getting us started in such a thoughtful manner, and the other respondents, Professors Lovett, Laurie, and Losier, for making their own contributions at a very high level. And I hope you look forward to attending future events at the University Union this academic year. Wish you all a good evening. Feel free to come up and interact with the speakers. I hope that they're able to stay for a few more minutes in case members of the audience would like to speak to them privately. Thank you very much.